Mrs. Puff is a full-blown psychopath in disguise, and by the end of this video, you'll be wondering why the hell she isn't locked up already. She might look innocent, but she traps SpongeBob in boating school hell in The Bully. So it all starts off pretty innocently, with SpongeBob sitting in boating school, minding his own business. Mrs. Puff waltzes in with a big announcement. There's a new student joining the class, and his name is Flats the Flounder. What the F kind of name is that? Did your parents hate you? I smell bad vibes from this asshole. Anyway, whatever. Flats immediately turns to SpongeBob and says, out of nowhere, that he's going to kick his butt.
Hi, SpongeBob. I'm gonna kick your butt.
See? Asshole detected. Does Mrs. Puff notice this red flag? Nah, she's already checked out. Honestly, she's the least observant authority figure ever. If she'd been paying even an ounce of attention, maybe she could have stopped what was about to unfold. Or maybe she just doesn't give a shit since it's SpongeBob and he drives her nuts. Flats spends the rest of the day terrorizing SpongeBob, and what does Mrs. Puff do about it? Sweet fanny f***all. SpongeBob is running around like an anxious wreck trying to avoid this butt-kicking flounder. Naturally, he seeks help from the only adult in the room, Mrs. Puff.
Can I be excused for the rest of my life?
Get this, she shrugs it off and pulls some bogus explanation out of thin air, claiming that kick your butt is just Flat's way of saying he wants to be friends with SpongeBob. Puff? Where on earth did you get that from? Now, it's clear Mrs. Puff isn't just out of touch, she's actively sabotaging SpongeBob's safety and gaslighting the shit out of him. Fast forward a bit, and SpongeBob is so paranoid that he tries going to Flat's dad for help. You'd think maybe, just maybe, Mrs. Puff would have done something by now, like, I don't know, report the violent behavior? But nope, Mrs. Puff is still in La La Land. Flat's dad, useless. Flats threatens him too, and of course, my dude SpongeBob skedaddles out of there like his life is on the line. Poor guy's left fending for himself because Mrs. Puff has officially chucked him to the wolves. Flats is chasing SpongeBob through the streets, attempting to run him over with a garbage truck. Can we just pause here for a second and acknowledge the insanity of this situation? This is full-on attempted vehicular manslaughter, and it's happening right under Mrs. Puff's nose. But is she anywhere to be found? Hell no! The one person who's supposed to be in charge is AWOL, while one of her students goes full Grand Theft Auto on another. This level of negligence is downright dangerous and literally leading to criminal activities. Eventually, SpongeBob pulls a superhero move and saves Flat's life with some marathon CPR.
This young boy saved your life. He performed CPR for 5 hours straight.
But this twat Flats is still gunning for him. Flats continues to chase SpongeBob all over Bikini Bottom while the townspeople misinterpret the situation and end up kicking an innocent old man's butt by mistake. Total chaos. Where's Mrs. Puff? Still MIA, motherfucker. Now this is where things get really bonkers. Flats finally tracks SpongeBob to his own home and starts beating the bejesus out of him. Thankfully, SpongeBob's squishy body absorbs all the blows and Flats eventually passes out from sheer exhaustion. Mrs. Puff finally makes an appearance after a week of this nonsense. Does she acknowledge that Flats has been terrorizing SpongeBob all week? Nope! Mrs. Puff takes one look at the scene, Flats unconscious on the floor, SpongeBob standing there, and immediately pins SpongeBob as the aggressor. Mrs. Puff's reaction is so irrational, it's almost impressive. Without even asking a single question, she flips out on SpongeBob, blaming him for the whole thing and accusing him of beating up the new kid. And she doesn't just stop there. She threatens to kick SpongeBob's butt herself.
I'm going to kick your butt!
Seriously, what kind of teacher is this? This lady is completely unhinged, threatening violence against her own student with absolutely zero evidence. But she lets even more crazy crap happen in No Free Rides. We kick off at Mrs. Puff's boating school, where SpongeBob, big surprise, fails his final boating exam for the year by running over none other than the French narrator. Yep, dude didn't even see it coming. SpongeBob's all smiles, optimistic about next year, but Mrs. Puff? Nah, she's basically seeing her entire life flash before her eyes, and none of it is good. She's straight up dreading the thought of another year with SpongeBob. Geez, who can blame her? Mrs. Puff, in her desperation to never see SpongeBob again, offers him an extra credit assignment that's about as low effort as it gets.
Extra credit!
A 10-word essay. 10 words. That's literally less effort than tweeting. I'm telling you, the next step is mental breakdown. Now, SpongeBob being SpongeBob can't even handle that simple task. Guy's having a full-on panic attack, so Mrs. Puff just gives him his license. No exam, no real test, just, oh, you're stressed? Here's your driving license. Have fun terrorizing the streets of Bikini Bottom. It's like she wants him to land in jail. Maybe she does. At this point, Mrs. Puff is practically losing her grip on reality, and SpongeBob nabbing that license is her way of hitting the eject button on sanity. Puff has a moment of clarity, though. She realizes she's made a terrible mistake. She starts to panic, imagining SpongeBob literally driving the entire city into ruin, and let's be real, that's not even an exaggeration. It's exactly what's going to happen. Instead of taking any real action like, I don't know, revoking the damn license, she decides it's not a big deal because SpongeBob doesn't own a boat. Problem solved, right? Wrong! As soon as she gets home, she finds SpongeBob and his parents waiting for her with a giant cake to thank her for finally passing him. And then comes the real nutcrack. SpongeBob's parents bought him a brand new boatmobile. At this point, Puff is having a full-on breakdown. The fish looks like she's seen a ghost. SpongeBob faints from excitement, but Puff is plotting, my dudes. SpongeBob is going to level the town. So what's a girl to do? She goes full cray-cray and steals the boat. Yep, Puff sneaks out under the cover of night and hijacks SpongeBob's boat. What even is this plan? She steals the boat to what? Hide it? Destroy it? Who knows? Her mind is so scrambled at this point, I'm not sure she even knows. What's crazy is that SpongeBob wakes up mid-theft, sees a masked figure in the driver's seat, and instead of calling the police or, just letting her have the boat, he fights her off. I can't decide what's more ridiculous, Puff going full Need for Speed or SpongeBob trying to stop her. The chase that follows is nothing short of wild. Puff is doing everything she can to shake SpongeBob off, from trying to knock him out of the boat to pulling stunts that would make a Fast and Furious look tame. SpongeBob, of course, holds on for dear life, even as they tear through obstacles and cause chaos throughout Bikini Bottom. But, bruh, wait, the cops are watching the entire time? These dumbasses don't even step in. They just watch Mrs. Puff, the teacher, trying to lose SpongeBob in a high-speed chase. Eventually, SpongeBob outs Mrs. Puff as the thief right as the boat crashes into a police car. Yeah, it was only a matter of time before this whole thing ended in disaster. So Puff ends up exactly where she belongs, in jail. Mrs. Puff is completely off her rocker, passing SpongeBob when he was clearly unqualified, stealing his boat to stop him from driving, trying to shake him off in a high-speed chase. This woman is a danger to herself and everyone around her. She's so desperate to escape the nightmare that is SpongeBob's driving, she's willing to throw every ounce of logic and sanity out the window. And Puff says hasta la vista to those last 3 brain cells in Hall Monitor. We're at boating school, and it's Hall Monitor time. Puff is totally trying to avoid giving SpongeBob any sort of responsibility, desperate to find someone else. I mean, can you blame her? This is friggin' SpongeBob. I wouldn't trust him with a pencil. But Neptune ain't in her favor. Puff reluctantly ends up handing SpongeBob that Hall Monitor sash, and brah, you can practically see the storm brewing behind her eyes. She knows exactly what's going to happen. SpongeBob, being SpongeBob, turns what should have been a simple role into his personal TED Talk. His brief speech, it lasts the entire school day. Everyone, including Mrs. Puff, falls asleep. The only reason SpongeBob stops is because the day ends. Otherwise, he'd still be blabbering away, probably reciting the history of Hall Monitors all the way back to the bloody Bikini Bottom Dark Ages. Here's where Mrs. Puff's unhinged behavior really starts to show. SpongeBob's speech took up the entire day, and rather than just calling it a wrap and taking the uniform back, Mrs. Puff, in a moment of what I can only call pure insanity, lets him keep the sash until the next day. Why? What in Bikini Bottom's britches could possibly possess Puff to do that? It's almost like she wants him to cause trouble. We all knew this was going to end in chaos, but Mrs. Puff clearly didn't care. Or worse, she saw it coming and decided to let SpongeBob off the leash anyway. You know what? I'm done. Let's just move on. Now, once SpongeBob leaves school, things immediately go off the rails. Friggin' called it! The guy decides, hey, I'm not just the Hall Monitor for the school, I'm the Hall Monitor for the entire city. city. You'd think at this point Mrs. Puff would step in, call him back, or maybe even warn the citizens of Bikini Bottom. Nah, Mrs. Puff is MIA while SpongeBob plays citywide vigilante. His first stop, directing traffic. And when I say stop, that's literally what my dude does. He causes a massive traffic pileup that probably resulted in millions of dollars worth of damage. And where's Mrs. Puff? Kicking back and doing nothing while Bikini Bottom descends into chaos. Next, SpongeBob breaks into some couple's house in the middle of the day to scare them about the dangers of leaving a window open. Don't even get me started on why this idiot is wearing an open window maniac costume, because it's damn obvious why this was a crap idea. He basically terrorizes these innocent folks, and at this point, it's becoming clear that SpongeBob's lost all control. SpongeBob's reign of terror continues when he runs into Patrick, who's just trying to enjoy some ice cream. Of course, SpongeBob slaps a criminal label on his best friend for accidentally dropping his ice cream cone. It gets worse when they come across a newspaper announcing that a maniac is on the loose in Bikini Bottom. The best part? SpongeBob has absolutely no idea that the maniac is him. By this point, the city's in full panic mode, and Mrs. Puff still nowhere to be seen. She could have stopped this madness hours ago, but it's almost like she's actively avoiding getting involved. SpongeBob, fueled by his newfound hall monitor power, decides to hunt down the maniac with Patrick as his deputy, which leads to them running around town making things even worse. And then, the cherry on top of this Sunday, the cops show up and give Patrick a wanted poster of the maniac, aka SpongeBob. Of course, the dummy freaks out every single time he looks at the picture, not even realizing it's his best friend. The police have given up on trying to explain things. They're just trolling Patrick for kicks now by flashing the poster repeatedly. I really want to rant about these stupid cops, but that will take this whole last video, so whatever, I'ma leave it. Finally, night falls, and SpongeBob, still completely in the dark about being the maniac, hides from his own reflection. When he realizes that he's been the cause of the destruction all along, it's too late. SpongeBob's already bulldozed half the city. At this moment, Puff decides to make her grand entrance. Oh, now she's decided to get involved. Instead of taking any real responsibility, she just berates SpongeBob for her own failure.
You should be ashamed of yourself.
You know this guy?
Lady, you had one job: keep SpongeBob under control, and you let him run amok. Next thing we know, she confesses to the police that SpongeBob is her responsibility, so the cops arrest Puff because they assume she's confessing to causing the destruction. The episode wraps up with Mrs. Puff teaching from jail, a fitting end for someone who practically orchestrated the chaos. Honestly, the only thing more dangerous than SpongeBob on a power trip is Mrs. Puff, who enabled the whole thing and wanted it to happen. Which is exactly what Puff does in the next one on our list, doing time. So, SpongeBob is doing what he does best, ruining everything in sight while trying to pass his driving test. But instead of just wrecking a few cones, he goes full Mo Monkey mode, leveling the entire boating school, terrorizing the city, and driving off an unfinished bridge into a literal abyss. Like, there's no coming back from this one. This wasn't a simple, oops, I hit a curb. This was SpongeBob going full wrecking ball, and it's all happening under Mrs. Puff's supervision. Now, let me pause for a second. This woman, who is supposed to be the adult in the room, has let SpongeBob drive off an unfinished bridge. And somehow she's still employed? Not for long though, because the police show up and she's immediately sent to prison for gross negligence. Yeah, maybe the cops have finally caught on that Puff has been playing fast and loose with SpongeBob's driving education for way too long. But here's where the Krabby Patty gets juicy. Puff has a moment in prison. She clocks that with SpongeBob out of her life, this whole jail situation, it's not that bad. In fact, Puff's enjoying it. Yeah, this woman is so far in Delulu land that a life behind bars sounds better than another minute with SpongeBob behind the wheel. Meanwhile, SpongeBob is absolutely gutted that Mrs. Puff is in jail, and Patrick, being the genius he is, convinces him that it's all SpongeBob's fault. No lies detected there. So what do these two numbnuts decide to do? They plot to break her out of jail. If there's anyone less suited for a prison break than SpongeBob and Patrick, I haven't met them. Probably don't wanna. They start by trying to rob a bank, which, by the way, is a crime SpongeBob gets distracted from by all the bureaucratic niceties of opening a bank account. SpongeBob's out here trying to commit a felony, but ends up reading the fine print on loan terms. I can't make this crap up. It just makes no sense, bruh. Next, the duo disguises themselves as rocks. I'm not even going there. Hoping to blend in with the rocks that prisoners smash as labor. But Mrs. Puff, in the middle of her rock-breaking duties, spots them and calls for help, only for the guards to think she's hallucinating. This is where things get real unhinged. The guards believe she's losing it, talking to rocks, and move her to kitchen duty. At this point, I swear Mrs. Puff is spiraling into insanity in real time. But SpongeBob and Patrick don't stop there. They keep showing up in weirder places like vats of chili and her toilets. Yeah, I don't know, not exploring that further. Finally, she rips off the real guards' faces thinking it's SpongeBob and Patrick in disguise. Now the guards have had enough.
Let's face it, Puff. You've gone off the deep end.
Can we just, for a moment though, rewind to that part? She rips off their faces. What the flying nuts? Aren't these guys technically dead now? She just committed murder, people. Multiple homicides in a matter of seconds. So the guards strap her into a straitjacket and throw her into solitary confinement. Holy hell, it's about time. But here's the kicker in the groin. Even in her padded cell, Mrs. Puff can't escape SpongeBob. His face starts appearing on the walls, the floor, everywhere, and it's laughing at her. This woman has officially lost it. She's so deranged that even in her mind, SpongeBob is torturing her. The episode does this mind-bending trick where we jump between what's happening in real life and Mrs. Puff's twisted as F hallucinations. One minute she's in prison, the next she's back in the boat, driving off the cliff, and at some point a beefy inmate named Donna shows up in her visions. Like, who's Donna? Why is she driving the boat? Puff is so deep in her delusions, she's gone into full psychosis. This woman doesn't need driving school, she needs an insane asylum and a team of doctors. And just when you think things couldn't get more confusing, Mrs. Puff wakes up realizing SpongeBob's the one driving, and at this point she's just like, it. Between her total lack of control over SpongeBob, her delusions, and her eventual breakdown in a padded cell, it's clear this woman should never be in charge of another student ever again. She's a danger to herself, to SpongeBob, and to the entire city of Bikini Bottom. But the way Puff reacts to Mrs. Puff, you're fired is so deranged on so many levels. The episode opens with Mr. Fitz, the boating school superintendent, showing up to reevaluate Mrs. Puff's teaching certification. The whole ass reason for this little visit? Oh, nothing too wild, just the fact that SpongeBob has failed her class over 1.2 million times. Yup, million. I mean, it's not like SpongeBob is the next Albert Einstein behind the wheel, but still, 1 million failures? That's not a red flag, that's a full-blown SOS flare. But you know, Puff isn't really concerned about SpongeBob's abysmal track record. She's relieved when Mr. Fitz finally fires her.
No more SpongeBob?
Seriously, she doesn't even try to fight it. There's no, oh, I'll do better next time, or I've been trying my best. Nope, Mrs. Puff is downright giddy to be rid of SpongeBob and the impending doom that follows him every time he gets behind the wheel. Bruh. If losing your job over negligence makes you that happy, maybe it's a sign you weren't cut out for the gig in the first place. Enter Sergeant Roderick, the new over-the-top hard-as-nails drill instructor who immediately takes over Mrs. Puff's job. This dude is not messing around. He storms in, smashes Mrs. Puff's ID card in a fit of toxic masculinity, and throws students out left and right for the smallest infractions. This guy is running a boating class like it's SEAL team training. Naturally, everyone else dips out fast except for, you guessed it, our boy SpongeBob. He sticks around and actually starts doing well under Roderick's insane regime. And when SpongeBob starts performing better under this military-grade torture, it's clear that Mrs. Puff has been slacking for a while now. But you know what? She gives zero She's out there living her best life, painting in a meadow or some nonsense, without a single thought about SpongeBob's bloody antics. Okay, so it's SpongeBob's final test with Sergeant Roderick, so he decides he needs his trusty blindfold, because apparently the only way he knows how to drive is by not seeing anything. Don't even get me started on the logic here, just non-existent. Anyway, Roderick tells him to take the blindfold off and gives him some vague instructions to use the brakes. Simple enough for most people, but SpongeBob SpongeBob? Nah, he straight up removes the brakes. Next thing we know, Puff is scooped up by SpongeBob's runaway boat while she's painting. She barely even reacts at first. How numb to chaos do you have to be to just casually get whisked away by a reckless sponge without blinking an eye? But it gets worse. Sergeant Roderick tries to stop the boat by literally jumping in front of it. Bold move, Roderick. Not smart, but bold. And SpongeBob runs him over like a cartoon steamroller.
Man down! Man down!
Does Mrs. Puff freak out? Nope, she's just along for the ride at this point, like the deranged teacher she secretly is. This is the same woman who earlier in the episode was thrilled to lose her job, only to get dragged back into SpongeBob's chaos. By the time SpongeBob parks the boat after blind driving his way through half of Bikini Bottom again, he obviously fails the test, having caused massive destruction. Duh. Mr. Fitz, bless his heart, realizes that SpongeBob is unteachable even with a military-grade psycho like Roderick at the wheel. So what does he do? He rehires Mrs. Puff because apparently nobody else is masochistic enough to handle SpongeBob's level of chaos. Mrs. Puff's reaction? Pure devastation. This is not the sigh of relief from someone who loves her job. This is the reaction of a woman trapped in a nightmare she can never escape from. SpongeBob is her eternal curse, and there's no way out. Maybe half the reason she's gone down Nutter Lane is because she's been stuck working at a job with all this ridiculous shit going on for too long. She just snapped somewhere along the line and whoops, here we are. Anyway, back to this crazy crap. So the final blow, SpongeBob shows up the next day all chipper and hands Mrs. Puff her repaired ID card as a welcome back gift. How thoughtful, right? This lady is crumbling inside, tears streaming down her face because she knows she's trapped in this never-ending hellscape. And SpongeBob tells her that it's like he never failed because his file was destroyed in the fire. What fire? When did this happen? Never mind. It's like SpongeBob's entire history of failure just vanished, and Mrs. Puff has to start from scratch. It's enough to make anyone have a breakdown. Mrs. Puff ends up crying, shattered, as SpongeBob promises it won't take him 1,000,000 times to pass. But we all know the truth. It absolutely will take him another 1,000,000 times. So Puff is stuck with the bastard. She needs to be locked up, people. So I'ma just add more evidence to my argument here. SpongeBob is back at Mrs. Puff's boating school. Again. But this time he's locked into a deal against his will in Lighthouse Louie. This time SpongeBob is trying to read while driving because apparently driving into a bloody brick wall is a great way to pass your test. I could have predicted this, seriously. My dude swerves just in time to avoid the wall but heads straight for Mrs. Puff's lighthouse. And boom. Junk explosion. SpongeBob tries to clean up his mess by pulling Mrs. Puff out of the rubble. She's like, thanks, SpongeBob, but now you need to clean out the entire lighthouse full of 20 years worth of junk. And then she just pieces out to blast some heavy metal music in her classroom. Okay, that's totally normal behavior after getting caught in an explosion. Now, if you thought SpongeBob's effort to clean up the lighthouse were anything but heroic, think again. He's actually eating trash and spitting it into boxes like a human garbage disposal. That's just f***ing gross, but whatever. So this lighthouse isn't just a junk pile, it's a haunted house now, too. SpongeBob hears moaning, and because he's SpongeBob, assumes it's haunted. See, this is where you're letting superstition mess with your head, you darn idiot. When SpongeBob discovers that the moaning is coming from a stray snail, he names it Louie and tries to clean while battling this snail's chaotic interference. Louie, the so-called haunted snail, is doing a full-on Houdini act, appearing and disappearing, outsmarting SpongeBob at every turn. This thing is in full feral mode. As SpongeBob is trying to catch him, he inadvertently turns on the lighthouse's blinding light, causing a freakout across Bikini Bottom. The lighthouse, now essentially a giant-ass rolling pin, starts causing chaos everywhere it goes, flattening Bubble Base, rampaging towards the Krusty Krab, and leaving a trail of destruction in its wake. Mrs. Puff, still rocking out to her heavy metal, completely oblivious to the disaster her negligence has caused. Seriously, how tone-deaf can one person be? Or is this pufferfish purposely ignoring the shitfest going on? SpongeBob tries to steer the lighthouse away from the Krusty Krab, but with Louie attacking him, he only ends up crashing into the place. Now, Mr. Krabs and the rest of Bikini Bottom are livid. good. Mrs. Puff finally notices the aftermath and gets confronted by the angry townsfolk, but get this, she puts on her headphones again and jams out with Louie and her babies like they're living in some sick, twisted musical. This episode lays it out clearly. Mrs. Puff's behavior is downright criminal. She's so detached from reality that she's rocking out to heavy metal while her lighthouse, her responsibility, turns into a mobile disaster machine. Puff, it's high time you face the consequences of your actions, preferably behind bars where you can't wreak any more havoc. But then again, Puff will hand out havoc like candy and see no consequences for it in boating school. SpongeBob is rolling up to Mrs. Puff's boating school, all pumped up because my dude's finally getting his driver's license, in his mind at least. He's so psyched he chucks his unicycle aside like it's yesterday's old sock. Bruh, did you forget the bajillion times you failed this bloody test? It's like your second hobby. Don't be getting all hasty now. But SpongeBob is motor-mouthing answers before Mrs. Puff even finishes asking the questions. This dude's basically a walking, talking driving manual. Great and all, but then we hit the driving portion of the test. Suddenly, it's like SpongeBob's brain short-circuits and the boat turns into a death trap, crashing into a lighthouse and making Mrs. Puff inflate like a goddamn balloon. Between Puff's inability to control SpongeBob's manic driving and her stress-induced inflation, it's clear that this boating instructor's got some serious issues. You thought your driving test was nerve-wracking. Later, SpongeBob's at home, moaning to Gary about his epic fail. Gary's probably like, I'm a cat man, I don't do motivational speeches. But then Patrick chimes in with his usual brilliance, talking to SpongeBob through a walkie-talkie while cross-dressing in SpongeBob's clothes and calling himself Patrick Squarepants.
Patrick Squarepants!
Seriously, Patrick, you're creative in the least helpful way possible. SpongeBob's too bummed to appreciate the hilarious costume anyway. Instead, he just needs someone to help him think straight during his next driving test. Patrick's brilliant plan? Stick a walkie-talkie in SpongeBob's head, like that's not going to raise any red flags. Come on, if you're gonna cheat, then stick the thing somewhere where the bloody antenna isn't gonna give you away like a dumb nut. Take some advice from the chess grandmasters or something. I don't know, I'm done with this. Moving on. SpongeBob's cruising up to the test with Patrick's voice echoing in his noggin. It's like SpongeBob's got his own personal driving instructor, but the dude's more interested in munching his food and reading his diary than guiding our spongy friend. So, SpongeBob aces the test this time. Yeah, of course he does. Patrick's coaching him through every move like an illegal driving guru. Mrs. Puff's jaw drops so hard it practically hits the floor. But then she jokes about SpongeBob having an antenna under his hat, giving him all the answers from some guy miles away.
And some guy miles away from here is giving you all the answers.
Whoa, my dude is so screwed. She's onto him. Let me pause here, though. This is where we see that Mrs. Puff ain't as dim-witted as she appears. It seems she's got some nasty acting skills she's hiding. Pretending to be surprised before dropping the crap nugget that she knows SpongeBob was cheating, it's like she wants to mess with him after he's made her life hell too many times. WTF ever, I digress. SpongeBob's like, haha, good one, until Mrs. Puff lets him in on the little secret: cheating is a huge no-no. I don't know how this idiot didn't figure this out already. How the hell did you not think this was gonna land you in trouble? I'm telling you, SpongeBob should have followed my advice and shoved that walkie-talkie up his ass. Realizing he's been cheating, SpongeBob flips out like he's just found out his whole life is a lie. Patrick uselessly takes off crying. And what does SpongeBob do? He freaks out, drives like a nutjob, and crashes the boat again. This time, Mrs. Puff inflates again. Seriously, girl's gotta work on her stress management. She's gonna have a breakdown at this rate. Not to mention her questionable approach to cheating suggests a major-ass flaw in her teaching methods. Is it that she can't keep her students in check, or maybe that she doesn't want to? The whole scene is a disaster, with SpongeBob sobbing and Mrs. Puff flailing around. It's just like watching a car crash in slow motion, but with more inflatable puffing. But Puff's sanity is crushed in demolition doofus to murderous proportions. The episode starts with SpongeBob doing what he does best, wreaking havoc in boating school. Surprise, surprise, he's in the middle of yet another driving test, and shocker, he's crashing into everything.
What do you say, Mrs. Puff? Let's get this party started.
But this time it's not just a simple bump here and up there. No, SpongeBob's driving skills have officially crossed over into nightmare fuel territory. He keeps slamming into the same two cars over and over again, each time inflating Mrs. Puff like a Macy's Thanksgiving Day parade balloon. Now, you'd think after the first puff up, Mrs. Puff would call it a day and hit the panic button. But nope, she just stands there, letting SpongeBob turn her into a balloon animal. Eventually, she inflates so much that she lifts their entire car into the water, turning it into a flying death trap. Okay, so they're airborne or waterborne, I don't care. So what does SpongeBob do? He drives it straight into the boating school's lighthouse. Duh. The crash cripples Mrs. Puff for life. Let that sink in. For life. Yikes. Now Mrs. Puff is in the hospital and she's not in a good mood. Her inflation sac, the one thing that makes her a pufferfish, is completely destroyed. The doctor's like, yeah, you'll never puff up again. And honestly, that's the least of her problems. SpongeBob, being the oblivious dumbass he is, makes a joke about her being crippled and Mrs. Puff completely loses it. Like, we're talking nose-grabbing, full-on crazy lady rage mode. I mean, I get it, this sponge has gone too far, but whoa, somebody sedate her quick. Here's where Mrs. Puff crosses the line. She's not just upset, she's deranged, lost it, MIA, whatever the fudge nuggets you want to call it, girl's lost her marbles. She has to be tranquilized because she's so out of control. SpongeBob keeps yammering on like he's completely clueless, so the doctor gives him a tranquilizer too. At this point, they should just start handing out tranquilizers to everyone involved. Everyone needs a nap. SpongeBob, obviously still not getting the memo, visits Mrs. Puff with a bouquet of flowers, except it's like the 100th bouquet he's sent, and oh yeah, she's allergic to them. So now Mrs. Puff is dealing with being permanently crippled and sneezing her brains out, all thanks to SpongeBob. But instead of taking a moment to reflect on her life choices, like say stop teaching SpongeBob, she decides to take things way too far. She's rolling around the hospital in a wheelchair when SpongeBob stops to ask the doctor about a bunch of muscleheads duking it out in the hallway. The doctor casually mentions they're part of a demolition derby, and guess what? This sparks Mrs. Puff's evil genius plan. You can practically see the gears turning in her head. She starts laughing maniacally, which, is always a good sign. Her insane plan: enter SpongeBob into the derby so that he gets absolutely obliterated by professional smashers. I'm talking full-on murderous scheme here. Puff is now plotting her student's death via a demolition derby. Does this sound like the behavior of a mentally stable individual? No, it does not. So Puff pulls some strings with this guy, Captain Lutefisk, and enters SpongeBob as Le Squish, which sounds dangerous and damn hilarious. This is SpongeBob though, so he is so crap at driving, he accidentally ends up taking out everyone else in the derby. He's fine though, so we're all good. Mrs. Puff, watching her plan fall apart in real time, completely snaps. This is the breaking point, people. Puff, in a fit of unhinged rage, steals a monster truck and goes after SpongeBob herself. She's not just trying to scare him anymore, she's trying to crush him. We're officially in murder territory. Puff has gone from frustrated teacher to full-blown homicidal maniac in a matter of minutes. And how does that turn out? Well, like everything in Puff's life, it crashes and burns. Literally. She chases SpongeBob all over Bikini Bottom, smashes through walls, and eventually they both end up crashing right back into the boating school, which, by the way, is destroyed again. In a twist of fate, Mrs. Puff miraculously regains her ability to puff up. But this isn't a victory, it's a cruel irony, because at this point, she's so deep into her own madness that puffing up again is the least of her concerns. The school's tower collapses on both of them, ending the episode with SpongeBob and Mrs. Puff buried in the rubble. Brah, if Puff could have gotten away with taking SpongeBob out, she absolutely would have. No remorse, no second thoughts, just pure, unfiltered rage. But the lack of remorse on Puff's face is clear in Picture Day. So, it's boating school picture day, and SpongeBob is just trying to get through the morning looking fresh. And when I say trying, I mean failing miserably. It all starts off like any normal SpongeBob routine: crayons for toothpaste, yikes, sock lighting, and a ridiculously cheerful vibe. Everything set for him to nail the perfect picture. From the get-go, it's like fate hates SpongeBob. First, some random seaweed clings to him like that annoying ex who won't take the hint. So SpongeBob redoes his whole morning routine because he's a perfectionist. But the second he steps out, he gets dunked in a garbage truck. But wait, it gets worse. Squidward just sits back and laughs at him, like, thanks for the support, bro. But SpongeBob's determined, so he tries again. This time, a gang of rebellious teens armed with ketchup are ready to strike. They miss, but Old Man Jenkins doesn't, squirting SpongeBob with ketchup like he's a spongy hot dog. Another wardrobe change. This is like Groundhog's Day, but grosser. Okay, so fast forward through a whole bunch of mishaps and numbskullery involving our two village idiots, Patrick and Sponge Boy. We get the picture. He keeps getting dirty and has to show up at the boating school eventually. Now, here's where Mrs. Puff really gets the Worst Teacher of the Year award. Instead of showing an ounce of empathy for SpongeBob, who's clearly at his breaking point, this lady just drags him inside for his picture, kicking and screaming. Dude is bawling his eyes out, covered in taco grime, and she's like, "We need this picture." No compassion, no chill. But does it end there? The cameraman douses SpongeBob in water and shoves him into an outfit that's at least 2 sizes too small, like this is gonna make everything better. When SpongeBob still won't stop crying, they go full nightmare mode and throw dentures in his mouth to force a smile. What the actual Mrs. Puff is sitting there begging him to hurry up and smile while SpongeBob's living his worst day ever. It's like psychological torture. And then, click. Picture snapped. Mission accomplished for Mrs. Puff. But let's be real, the woman has no business teaching kids. How do you put someone through that and not get reported? She needs to be locked up before someone else's life is ruined. After watching her snap like that, it's clear Mrs. Puff needs to be in prison yesterday. That's it, folks. Case closed. Mrs. Puff, guilty as charged. But hey, I'm just a guy who likes cartoons, so I'll return to my shows. I'll catch you in the next video.